Oh, thank God I wasn't recording when I said what I said.
Well, but I mean, I don't necessarily think that's a racist statement.
No, I know.
That's the first thing on the recording. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to numbers, right? But if we think about it from a data science perspective, the HS replay site, it collects information about what things are working in different regions and stuff like that. So, I mean, if you go up to decks here, it shows you what's currently, so I'm playing effectively this deck. So it's the current second highest win rate. Actually, it's pretty close to the highest win rate deck right now. On average, you're still at the mercy of who you're playing against and the matchups and stuff like that. But well, yeah, you got to play it competently. I mean, like what I tell people is when I first started playing, I would, you know, I threw money at the problem to get the collection of cards. So I had the, you know, I had the correct deck put together. I had all the cards that they said was awesome. And I would be playing it and I would like look at a card and I'm like, why is this even in here? This is useless. And then like 2 weeks later, after I'd gotten a bunch of experience to it, I realized that like the whole deck is built around that card. Not only is it not useless, it's like the gold of the deck. So, I mean, it just ultimately it's time and whatever, but I'm pretty good for an older guy, I guess. It's the punchline. All right, let's get this. I wonder if in Korean currency, if $400 US dollars per month is like a good deal or a bad deal for them. Is the
I'm sure we can find out real quick.
Because like $400 per month in like Indian rupees, you know, that's like what like the president there makes.
Is it South Korean or North Korean?
I guess I'm not 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure it's South Korean. That would be kind of funny though. I realize I'm like part of like a data trafficking thing. They're overlaying stuff on my stream, delivering information. All right, so let's homework for today. Let me get Keynote open. Was to start writing our parser where we were picking out matching the opening, closing curly braces, right? That was the guy for today. Okie dokie. So let's.
$1 US dollar is over 1,000 South Korean.
Okay, yeah, but that is the better question is what's the average salary for somebody in, you know, like when I was in India, the head chef at the 5-star hotel they put me up in made $1,500 a year, US dollar equivalent, and that would be like a job that would probably pay $80,000 to $100,000 a year here.
How often do you get $400?
Every month. Yeah. So you remember our very first comment was whether or not his statement was racist?
Oh no.
It's really funny because nobody in the recording knows what that statement
That's right.
was.
That's right.
They're just gonna
It's a
assume
myth.
it was racist.
It probably was. All right. So let's look at some code.
You're getting the short end of the stick.
Am I?
Yeah. You're making about 10, we're getting about 10 times less than the average South Korean.
It's okay. I'm streaming a video game.
You're right.
And I'm up at 5 in the morning anyways. So I'm streaming while I'm doing my stretching at the kitchen sink, which is a whole nother problem. Who does that at the kitchen sink? But that's where the bagels are. It's also where the coffee machine is. Yeah. Okay, so we have a string that kind of looks like this. We gave ourselves a sample string, and we've already seen a string that looks like this coming in, so we can actually test it after we write this against the URL that we're reading in. But let's get a starting point here. We're going to write some logic that's going to go ahead and start processing this string character by character by character, ultimately getting everything that's in between the opening and closing square brackets, right? With the ultimate goal of making sure that we can process things with no guarantee that there aren't square brackets in between. So notice here I have I've inserted a trick, the opening and closing square brackets there. So we're going to need to do a little bit of a counting game to do this. So let's just write our logic right here in inside here. So we'll say for, let's give ourselves a string temp as our starting point. That's the guy we're going to build up. Go ahead. I'm not sharing my screen. Thank you. All right, now we're good, right? Okay.
Quick question.
Yo.
Would it be possible to write this in like a different function instead of writing it inside of main?
We can. So what you want to do?
Yes, please.
Okie dokie. So you want to do it another function inside of here?
Yes.
Okay.
I want to see if you have to like do anything like at the top with the C++, with like including the function or not.
Okay. Then I'll write it the right way. So what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and let's. Do you want this function to return the string that is the built-up thing?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll say string process JSON, something like that. This guy will take in a string JSON as a parameter, something like that. Now, technically, and then I'll come to you. Technically, since we're going to be calling this function up here, so I'll say something like string answer is equal to process JSON, and I'll pass it my JSON string. And then we'll do something like cout answer endl. All right, so technically, since I am calling this method here before I am writing this method, more than likely this will work in modern C++ compilers, but technically I should prototype this up top. So this is effectively saying prototype all functions before implementation so they can be used before they are implemented. Effectively, we're saying allow C++'s compiler to say, you told me that you're going to be writing this guy, so it'll compile later on. That's why I put the little header thing up here and then the method down here. Now, I could have just put this method up there, but that doesn't really necessarily always fix the problem because you could have a situation where one function is reliant on another function, which is reliant on the other function. So then you have a circular relationship with which one do I write first? The reality is you prototype all of them first, and then the header file answer is the more modern way of doing it is you put those prototypes inside of a header file. Okay, and if you want to see that, I can do something like this. Maybe call it my functions.h, something like that. We'd actually call it HPP, but I'm not actually putting I could use .h because I'm actually putting C stuff in there, but it's not going to make any difference. And then what I would do here is I would take that line and I would put that inside of my functions HPP, like that. Now, it doesn't know about the string thing, so I have to do include string.h. I think he'll be happy now. Is it just string or is it just string? Oh, it's using namespace standard. And string.h?
And this string.
Which is it? There we go.
Hey, we got it.
All right, so now that I prototyped it in here, I can include my functions HPP over here in driver. So I would include my functions HPP here. and now it knows about them. So I just hid it inside that other file. All those things do the identical thing. Yeah.
So then when you're compiling, you need to add my function where they compute it to the segment.
No, because when you compile, you only need to do the CPP files. It'll find the header files because you've included them inside the CPP files.
Okay, so that's what I was asking. Do driver.cpp header file? Or is there like, is that the bad
Well,
practice to do that?
From our perspective, the only thing that needs a header file, and actually doesn't even need a header file, is objects. Because we prototype the object, then we implement the object.
Okay, well, it would be a good practice to practicing header files for most files.
No, I mean,
I'm still trying to get my head like around the
I think a good example of where header files came from is what we just did here. We said, hey, I have a function I'm going to write. And inside this header file, all I'm doing is I'm giving kind of a quick list of things that I will be writing. That's what the header file has in it. Now, from a human being's perspective, we look at this and we say, here's a quick thing of a bunch of functions this dude wrote, right? So maybe I have, this functions library. But on the other side, from a compiler perspective, when it includes this, it's going to say, here's some stuff that you're saying, more than likely, you're advertising, I'm probably going to be using some stuff from here inside my code. Therefore, I know about those. So when the compiler gets to this line right here, even though I'm not implementing it till down here, when it gets to this line right here, it's going to say, oh, I've heard of that guy. You told me about it in the header file. I know that he takes a string in as a parameter. I know that he returns a string. So he can check and say, you're catching it in a string, you're giving it a string. That looks good to me. We'll scream later if your implementation has some issues. Yeah.
So with like header files, like say you got a function that you, I guess, what was the terminology you're using when you before you put the function up before you actually
Prototype it?
Yeah, when you're prototyping it, could you also use it to like list what the function does? Like, would you do that by comment?
Yeah, you could put a comment in there. Yeah, that's because comments aren't compiled.
You don't need to like have the two curly brackets and have everything between it and the header file.
You wouldn't. Yeah, you would not have. Nothing keeps you from putting the implementation in there. I could, in that header file, I could put the implementation because I think maybe this will connect the dots for you. When I say include my functions.hpp here, when I compile it, it replaces that line with the entire contents of that file. So if I put implementation stuff in there, that's fine. It's not the intended use for header files, but all it's doing is it's taking that line and it's pasting the contents of that file in there.
If that's how that works, then you theoretically define a class in the HTTP file.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, because you don't have to use header files. You could literally put everything inside of one big file. It allows you to create your program in terms of modules, so it's a little bit easier to manage rather than having this wall of code.
So it's more of like a thing that's good practice.
Well, right. I mean, but it's just the same as in real life. In real life, it's probably reasonable to, be organized. I know that my stuff about cards goes in the cards .cpp file. I know that my stuff about, the thing that drives the program goes in the driver.cpp file. I have a bunch of extra functions that I'm writing for just like helper things. So maybe I just have this my functions thing that I kind of pass around. And
Okay, so when you're writing header files, then would you also include stuff you already included in the CPP file? Like, for example, if you include string.h in this file, would you want to do it?
yeah, see, that's where it gets a little bit more, it was sus?
Yeah.
Sus, that's where it gets a little bit more suspicious. It stands for suspicious, right? We might actually even be able to see the error message or the warning message as we go through here. Typically, you would do, if not defined, define these things. Because there could be a situation where, for example, I am including my functions HPP here. And we know my functions HPP already has string in it, but driver has previously defined string.
So it might be easier to just do this, like having them both, so that when you're like typing it out, you get
It actually could be an error.
Good.
Yeah, if you have an in both. Wonder why I had string.h there.
I mean, I didn't think that helped me like understand the whole header.
Yeah, well, so let's go and compile this. Let's see if we can get the warning, and then I'll show you the if not defined thing. Okay, yeah, it's not giving me the error from it. Because the idea here is I mentioned that right here, it is literally taking this and pasting the contents in. It's doing that. So when I compile it, it's just ignoring the fact that I had already included string the second time.
Yeah, for some like include certain things and like throw an error. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because I mean, so historically we would have done something like this. Let me just backspace here. I think it's if not defined. No, what is it? And if. All right. Def. Just make sure I have the syntax right for this. Yeah. Isn't that how I wrote it?
Said hashtag index and hashtag define.
Well, but I'm not, I'm doing this with includes. I just want to make sure I give you the right syntax before I. Because it might be like an underscore HPP for C++. Maybe the once only headers. Okay, so I think the syntax for it would be this. If not defined, can we do it with just string? It seems very sus to me. Got my new words. Dope, dope, dope. Let me give another 30 seconds at this, otherwise I'll look at it offline and then you use the define. Yeah, let me look at this offline. That way I can explain it fully. But the idea is that you don't want to include string more than. you don't want it to paste string.h in twice, even though it'll let you do it. We would call that, you know, not best practices for writing your code. But your bigger question is dealing with when to use a header file and when not to use a header file. The reality for us is whenever you're prototyping functions, always put them in a header file. If you're writing a class, put it in a header file. Is the stuff that will be in the class. The implementation should go in the CPP file because we want to keep those things separate because it's good programming practice to be organized. That's the idea. So this would be, what was it, just string? All right, and then inside of driver, we went ahead and included this, which prototyped it for us, even though I think we could have not done that and it would still compile. I think it operates as a 2-pass compiler. Oh, you do need to prototype it. Yep, so it gave us the error saying, look, I've never heard of this guy. What happened there? It ran into this line right here and said, look, you never told me about something called process JSON. And I'm like, well, you know what? I defined it right here. I don't care. As far as I'm concerned, as I'm going through this line by line by line by line, compiling it, I ran into something I've never heard of. So we let him know about that by including where it's prototyped, which is in my functions HPP. And now he'll compile. He's heard of it now. That doesn't mean I've implemented it. We've given him the promise that we will be implementing it. Okay, so down here in process JSON, this guy is going to go ahead and he's going to take in that JSON string. We're going to be building up the inside contents of that guy. All right, so what we want to do is we want to keep reading stuff in as long as we hit, for right now, we can assume that the opening thing is a opening square bracket. We know we're dealing with an array. We can ask that question if we want. We can say, if JSON at bucket 0 is equal to an array, what does this mean? Process contents of the array. That's what we want to do in that case. All right, so we're going to start at bucket 1 and keep going up to the length of that array. So for int I is equal to 0, I is less than JSON dot length. Is it length? I think it's a length method. I plus plus. All right, so that's going to take I, and actually I'm going to start at bucket 1. That's going to take I on a journey from bucket 1 up to potentially the very, very end. Okay, because what we're doing is we're collecting characters until we find the corresponding closing square bracket. Yeah, the opening square bracket would be a bucket 0. This guy right here. All right, so I'm going to keep track of a counter. So we're going to say int count starts off at 1. I have found an opening square bracket. Okay. In fact, we can say count square brackets. Let's be real explicit about it. I'm going to copy that because I do not want to type that again. Okay. Count square brackets is going to start off at 1. I have found an opening square bracket. Every time I find a closing square bracket, I'm going to decrement it. As soon as that guy is a 0, I'm done. I've captured my contents, right? And I can return the answer. But when I hit another opening one, what do? Increment it. Okay. So we're going to ask ourselves what we are currently looking at. We're going to say, if JSON at bucket I is equal to an opening square bracket, then I'm going to increment my count square brackets. Else if JSON at bucket I is equivalent to a closing square bracket. Then I'll decrement. Else, I'm going to go ahead and tack it on. We're going to add a little bit more code in here, but we're going to tack it on to our temp. So we'll say temp is equal to temp concatenated with JSON at bucket I. It wasn't an opening square bracket. It wasn't a closing square bracket. It was something else. We're going to keep it. Collect, 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 collect. Now, after I've decremented here, there is a possibility that it is now 0, which means that I'm done. If count square brackets is now equivalent to 0, we're going to return temp. That make sense? We know it's at least a 1 if we're inside this if statement. Otherwise, we collected a bunch of stuff and we finally hit, we can assume this is legally written JSON. We finally hit the legally written, the end of the legally written JSON array corresponding to the open one that we found. All right, we're gonna see this guy. We're gonna change his name in a little bit. We're gonna call it process array. Similarly, we're gonna have a process object. We're doing the opening curly braces, closing curly braces, dude. All right. So in any case, if I want to process JSON for this guy, and I'm looking at an array, do this stuff, ultimately, whenever I see a closing, decrement count, then say, did I just decrement it for the last time? Did I find the corresponding closing square bracket? The answer is yes. Go ahead and return temp. Now, I think we saw last time that C++ is actually cool with us not actually returning a value. Pretty certain. Let me just test that real quick before I, yep. So Java would scream at us, right? Java would say, hey, look, you wrote this function here. You told me you're going to return a string. You said, okay? In here, we as human beings know that, look, if it's correctly written JSON, we'll eventually get here. We just know that's how our string works, how our logic is working. But according to Java, okay, the compiler, for example, first of all, it can't guarantee that we're ever going to even get in this if statement, even though we know we will. It can't guarantee that this for loop, which is a pre-check loop, will even run one time. It can't guarantee that we'll ever get into this else if. There's like 3 or 4 boundaries sitting between our one return statement here and actually returning a value. Java would scream. Java would say, you told me you'll return a value. Your code does not guarantee that. Even though as a human being who's writing this, I know the nature of this is he will return a value. I'll eventually return a value. I would still say good programming practice says, if I'm still kicking down here, go ahead and return whatever's in temp. Or you can even do something like something went wrong. The only reason I'm here is something went wrong up above. Okay. More modern approach would be exception handling. Okay, if I'm still here, I didn't do my job up there, I'm going to throw some sort of exception, scream about it, but we're dealing with a little bit older school stuff here, so we'll just throw in this return, even though C++ wasn't complaining. This way we know that our function is going to give us a string. Might not be the string we wanted, but it'll give us a string. Go ahead.
So if you didn't have that return, something went wrong, and you gave it something that wasn't a JSON string, what would it?
It would give us a null value. It would boil down to null. And if you want to make that connection to Python, remember in Python, when we get that value none, if you ran a function that didn't return a value and you printed out the result of it, the result was none, nothingness, null, nil. Depends on the language, which of those synonyms it uses for defining nothingness. Okay, so we can go ahead and test this now. We're going to call our process JSON, pass it our JSON string. We get our answer back, which we hope is all this crap in the middle. All that stuff. Compile this. And there is, this is the original. And there's our answer. Oh, interesting. I didn't capture those. Yeah, so we have a little bug in our code right now. When I see an opening square bracket, I still need to capture it, right? If I see another one, I need to capture it. I want to put it onto my string. I also want to mess with my counter. So down here, I can do a couple different things. I can say, you know what? Don't only capture it if I'm in the else. Capture it regardless. If I ran into a character, capture it. Now, if it's an opening square bracket, increment. If it's a closing square bracket, decrement, and possibly dive out if it was the corresponding closing one. Let me run this real quick. So there is our answer with the opening and closing. Because now what I'm saying here in my code is, it doesn't matter if I hit this or neither. Always, 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 always concatenate on the character I just found. The only time that would not be true is if I had found a closing square bracket and it happened to be the corresponding closing one. In which case, I'm not going to capture that closing one because I've actually finished the job. All right, do you have a question? Okay. I didn't remove it. I built up a new string. I started with a fresh string. I started at bucket 1 on this guy. So I stepped past the very first opening one. And then when I read the very last closing one, if that was the last one, then I just collected my last thing on temp and return it. Yeah, so I didn't actually remove anything from the original string. I built up a new string, which was the contents of the inside. Okay, and that's pretty much a truth in most modern languages, that when we are doing string manipulation, we don't change the contents of a string. We build up new strings and kind of keep what we're interested in and omit the other stuff. You kind of think back to like 200 when we did those things like remove vowels, those things. What we didn't actually go through a string and remove the vowels. We built up another string that kept everything that wasn't a vowel. Go ahead.
So I'm not asking you to do this, but I'm just curious if this would work. Would you be able to write a function that, like, instead of returning a string that you built up, you returned an int that was the integer that corresponds to the corresponding closing bracket? And then
You mean the position?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be a pretty good idea and kind of where we're going, right? Because we have to know where do we leave off, right? Because we need kind of two pieces of information. If I'm saying, hey, I want you to process this array, that's fine. So if we think about, so here, let me just stop here and then let me answer this question, because that's where we're going next, right? So before I get into that, any questions about, I think this solves the homework. Does that sound accurate? All right, so let me go ahead and push this. I wrote a script for that, right? Oh, and some people were asking me about the script. All I did was put the commands, if I do cat push here. These are just the 4 lines that I write when I want to commit something to GitHub and then push it to GitHub. Once I got them working the first time, I just put those 4 commands into a text file, made that file executable so that I can do this. Cat's a Linux or Unix command that just concatenates any files that you put in there out to the screen.
Okay, so to make like a good file to roll, what extension do you have?
chmods 755, the name of the file. So in this case, it was the push file. Yeah, it sets the permissions on it. If I do this, notice how push, this one's in green. See over here, its permissions are executable for the owner, executable for the group, executable for everyone else, where these other ones are just read, write, and then read, read. And that's why they're not in green. Yeah, but for right now, for you guys, since this class isn't necessarily on Unix command line stuff, if you want to write a script, you can just copy my file or it has permissions, or create the first text file and then just change its mode to 755. And that will do the correct magic to make it executable. Make sense? All right, because I know some of you are struggling with the Unix commands, and I want you to get the experience. I'll just say it out loud again. The rationale for why we're using Linux and why we're doing this is, as computer scientists, you should constantly be uncomfortable with the technology you're using. That's how you become an expert in an abundance of technology, right? Okay, so we're third semester computer programming students now, so programming should feel kind of okay-ish to us. But now we're a little bit more uncomfortable because we're in C++ and it's a little bit more cryptic. Okay, we're also thrown into a new operating system that we're not used to using day in, day out like Linux, and that makes us a little bit uncomfortable as well. The best way to get good at these Linux command line things is just to use it all the time. Put in the reps, make it your daily operating system, something like that. But anything that you're going to need to use in here, I'll show you the command. Most of what we're going to do in here is just changing directories and that stuff. We're not having to do any sort of magical stuff, even if you see me sometimes do something from the command line, like edit a file like with VI or something. You won't have to do that. That's just something I'm doing real quick to accomplish it. You can use VS Code for all this stuff, but understanding Linux, being decent at Linux, is what separates you from grandpa, right? So if you go into the Best Buy, you don't get taken advantage of because you know technology probably better than the person that you're dealing with because you're a computer science major. Okay, so I did push it, right? Yep. So let's go back in here. So if we now go back in and we think about this guy as a little bit bigger of a situation. So let's say that I actually want to process this entire JSON string. Well, now we have a couple of different animals in here. And just for the moment, why don't we say, I just want to process arrays. But in this case, I have an outer array, but I also have an inner array, this guy right here. I want to prove that I can handle that inside one using the same logic that I use to handle the outside one. Okay, so if we call this guy, well, we'll just leave it called process JSON for right now. If I see an opening square bracket, what does this mean? What does an opening square bracket ultimately mean? What does an opening square bracket mean? If I'm walking through my JSON string and I hit an opening square bracket, what does that tell me? What kind of object? Opening square bracket. I run into this dude right here. What does that tell me? It's the start of what? JSON array. It's the beginning of an array specifically. All right. So what do I do when I run into an array? Maybe call process array. All right. So let's update our language here a little bit. So I'm going to call this guy process JSON array. Okay. And we're going to start moving towards what you were suggesting, where we kind of need to know where we left off sometimes, or at least we need to know where to start from, something like that. Maybe the start from is a better thing. So here's my whole string JSON, and then we have our int start. Okay, so initially here, when I call process JSON array, and I need to actually go into my header file as well and update that. I changed the name of my function. does become a little tedious, but it's not the end of the world. All right, but now my process JSON array, hold on, I need to also update the parameters this guy takes. There we go. That's the new version of process JSON array. It takes a string and it also takes a starting point in that string. Okay. So, how are we on time? We're good. This is not 10:55. We're 11:20. Okay, good. All right. So, process JSON array. Start with our JSON starting point. All right. So, we're going to ask if JSON at bucket start is equal to a square bracket, which we presume it will be, right? If that guy at bucket start is a square bracket, then what do we want to do? We want to set count square brackets to 1, and we're going to start at I is equal to start plus 1. All right, so we're not assuming we were at bucket 0. We're not assuming that we would start capturing at bucket 1. Instead, we're assuming that we're starting at bucket start, and we'll start capturing at bucket start plus 1. All right, first time start is 0. We'll start capturing at 1. Next time start is whatever this guy is, and we'll start capturing at that guy plus 1. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do here, rather than return for right now, I'm going to put my print statement in here. So I'm going to go ahead and say cout temp endl. That's what I meant. Totally sus, right? 100% sus. So good. What's this? Extremely sus. That was so funny how they were suspicious of me early on in the game last night when I didn't know what I was doing. It's like, how could that possibly? It's like, I really think it might be Littman. Even if it was me, I don't know. I don't know how to kill people. I think I'm going to lose. All right. Again, online people, they have no idea what we're even talking about. So they're like, what's he talking about? Doesn't know how to kill people? I'm talking about the Among Us World Championships last night that we played in. Let's see. What am I doing here? So I'm going to go ahead and make this guy not return a string anymore. We'll just have it be a void. So we're going to see how we're capturing it. I'll change it in my header file as well, because now we're actually going to want to see 2 separate outputs from process JSON array. One of them is going to be the full contents of the inside, which we've already seen. The other one will be that secondary array that it's going to process on the inside.
Did you get rid of that return statement down the bottom?
I will. Okay, so process JSON array is going to start at a starting point. Now, when we originally call this guy, our starting point will be 0. Oh, I'm capturing it in something. He returns a void. All right, and there's nothing to print out now because the thing prints itself. All right, so I'll call process JSON array. I'll pass it my string, and I'll pass it where to start in that string. Bucket 0. This guy takes in the string. He takes in that starting point. He makes sure, we probably don't need to make sure here, but it's not hurting us. He makes sure that the starting place is an opening square bracket. Probably shouldn't have called this function if it wasn't, but we're double checking. And we're going to go ahead and we'll count the square bracket starts off at 1, because I have 1 opening. start at bucket start +1, and I'm looking for the corresponding closing square bracket. All right, so whenever we hit an opening square bracket, I just asked this a few minutes ago, what does that mean? It means we're looking at a array, right? So what do? I call process JSON array, passing it that same JSON string and passing it the current starting point, which is I. Now, count square brackets ++ is still going to be good for this particular call through this method, this function. But I just called this function a second time. I call this pseudo recursion because it's not actually, well, let's see. It's not reliant on the secondary call. I'm just following the rules. The rules are, if I see an opening square bracket, what do? I process a JSON array. How do I process a JSON array? I call my function that knows how to process a JSON array. That's its job. that's what he does. Okay. At some point, we're going to be collecting these things, and we'll see that shortly. Okay. So if I'm looking at a square bracket, fine. What do? Process the JSON array starting from that bucket. And he's going to go and do his thing, presumably capture that opening square ball, capture the stuff inside that. While this guy, currently he's going to block because he's going to go and do his thing, and I won't get to this next line until this line has completed. But then I'll pick up where you left off and just keep going, capturing the stuff that's in there. Go ahead.
So when the recursion finishes, then that would be that print out?
Is no return statement anymore. Now is a void. But to your point, yes, when that guy, he would have printed something out in there when he finished. So what we should see when we run this is we should see this guy print out first. Then we should see the entire, I think we only have one one array in there. Then I should see the entire contents print out. Because we're processing, we're in the middle of processing the whole thing. So we're going through this, blah, 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 blah. Finally, we hit an opening square bracket. What do? We say, process this guy.
Yeah, because right now we're not checking for brackets.
Correct. Yeah, we're only processing arrays for the moment. But you can't guess what your homework assignment might be. All right. So we go through there. If we see an opening square bracket, what do? We call process JSON array. So we're looking at the beginning of a JSON array. Let him go do his thing. And then when he's done, we'll keep going where we're at and keep collecting and all that jazz. We see it closing. What do? Same thing we did before. If it's the correct corresponding closing, we'll just output. This is what I found. Here's my output. Build up our string. So we run this. There's our contents of the inner array. And then here's the contents of the whole thing. Right? So we captured those pieces. Okay. Now, what if we are looking at the curly brace stuff? So if I see an opening curly brace, what do? What's that? An opening curly brace means what? Beginning of a JSON object, right? Okay, so maybe I have a function called process JSON object where I collect all the crap on the inside, right? Until I find the corresponding closing curly brace. So we'll go ahead and prototype this guy. And we'll just follow the same pattern right now. We're effectively proving that we can deal with the individual spots. Then we're going to decide, well, what do I do with those things now that I've proven that I got them? Now that I have here's the string of the crap that was inside that array, or here's the string of the stuff that was inside of the curly braces. We haven't decided what we're going to do with that yet, okay? But we're getting those things. All right, so we'll call this guy process JSON object. He'll still take in the JSON. He'll still take in a start. this guy down here. All right. Now, realistically, in JSON, everything is an object. So objects start with two different things. So we could actually say something like, if JSON at bucket start is equal to an opening square bracket, then do what? Call process JSON array, passing it JSON and passing it start. Something like that. So then up here, we would actually just call process JSON object. We'll just say everything's an object. We'll call process JSON object. The first question it'll ask is, well, is this type of object actually a JSON array? If it is, let's go ahead and call process JSON array. Else, for right now, we're going to say must be an object. Because technically it could be just the JSON value. Okay. So this guy must be a JSON object. Which then means what we can do down here is we really don't need to ask this question if it's a square bracket. We'd only ever be in here if it was a square bracket. I'll just take that wrapper if statement out saying, you don't have to keep asking whether it's a square bracket. We only call process JSON array when bucket start in JSON is an opening square bracket. All right, so if it's an opening square bracket when I'm trying to process a JSON object, what do? Well, I just call process JSON array. That's what he's there for. Otherwise, we're going to assume right now he must be a, in fact, here, we'll even just do this. We'll say, yeah, else if JSON at bucket start is equal to an opening curly brace. This must be a JSON object. That's the kind of animal I must be dealing with, right? All right, so pretty similar to what we did before. We're going to collect our string. So we'll have string temp is equal to the empty string. We'll call this guy count curly braces. Is it curly like that? All right, we'll go through our for loop for int I is equal to start plus 1. So pretty similar to thing that we did right here. In fact, let me steal all this and we'll modify. Okay, now in here, what we're interested in is the curly brace stuff. So if I'm looking at an opening curly brace, then what do? I call process JSON object. Now that's if I'm looking at a curly brace. What if I'm looking at a square bracket? I asked the question about square brackets up here. So really inside here, if I'm looking at an opening curly brace, I want to call process JSON object. What do I do if I'm looking at an opening square bracket? I could directly call process JSON array, or couldn't I still call process JSON object, which then calls JSON array for me? So I can actually up here say, or, well, let's see. Probably want to do this separately since we are counting curly braces here. And I want to make sure I only increment my number of curly braces if I'm actually looking at a curly brace. All right, so if I'm looking at a curly brace, call process JSON object. If if I'm looking at a closing curly brace, decrement, if count curly braces is 0, we'll go ahead and output it. Else if JSON at bucket I is equal to a opening square bracket in here. Now, I could call JSON, process JSON object. Or since I happen to know that it's a square bracket, I actually save myself asking an extra question in a few minutes, right? I don't have to say, is it a square bracket? I know it's a square bracket right here. So since it's a square bracket right here, what do? I call process JSON array, passing it JSON and passing it the current starting point, which is I. Okay. Now, do I need to handle a closing square bracket in here? Yeah, only opens. A closing square bracket will be handled by process array. I'll still capture that closing square bracket right here, but I don't need to do anything special with it. Okay, what does this handle? This says, look, I am processing through a JSON object. If I run into the start of a new object, what do? I call process JSON object. If I run into the end of the current object, I decrement and find out, is this the end of the thing I care about? Otherwise, if I run into the beginning of an array, which would be the value of my JSON, the JSON object I'm currently processing, if I run into that guy, what do? I call process JSON array to go deal with that. But if I hit a closing square bracket, I don't do anything special inside of process JSON object. I grab it, it's part of the contents of my object, I'll tack it onto my string. I don't know what I'm going to use that string for, but I don't need to do any special actions right now related to that. All right, that makes some sense? All right, so now the hope is, as we walk through this, is the first thing we'll see printed out is that guy, the array. The second thing we see printed out will be that guy. The third thing we see printed out will be this guy. And the last thing we see printed out will be everything inside the opening and closing square brackets. So there's our, I don't think I saved. Process JSON object. Okay, that's saved. So I got the 1, 2, 3 first, and then it did the whole thing. Oh, I never did a C out, did I?
No, I think it's you call JSON object with the name JSON array, and it's originally going over to the array, but then it's never going back to object.
Oh, that's a good point. So the idea here is that she's collecting this. So we're inside JSON object, collect. Well, it's not that it's never going back. So we pause JSON array or JSON object first. Then we collect this stuff and output it. Then we go back to JSON object, and we pick up this guy, we pick up this guy, we pick up this guy, we pick those guys all up to tack it onto the thing. We hit our closing, but it's not detecting that as being our 0 for that first call to JSON object.
I don't think they are, but are the two functions using like the same counter?
No, definitely not the same counter. So we have a bug. Let's see what we're dealing with here. looking at opening square bracket called process JSON array. We saw that, it did its thing. If I'm looking at an opening curly brace, what do? I start building a new string. I have my counter for curly braces. I start at start +1, keep going. Every single time I hit an opening curly brace, I call process JSON object. Now, presumably, yeah, we're okay there because this is on the second one. So I hit an opening one, I call process JSON object. I then increment count curly braces. So if I kind of go through here, I'm starting right here, not an open, not an open, not an open. So we're collecting in the original temp. Then we hit this guy. Then we hit the closing curly brace, which ends this corresponding JSON object. So it's actually that we're not calling JSON object again, which maybe what you were saying. Because the next thing I'm going to hit is this comma and then this guy. So I'm never actually count curly braces is that. I hit the closing, said count curly braces minus minus. If count curly braces is equal to 0, go ahead and see out. Didn't we get the entire contents printed out? Because this will be a 1 and this would be a 0. So I should have seen that printed out is the idea here. So if I'm looking at a closing curly brace and I decrement count curly braces, if count curly braces is equal to a 0, I'll print out the current value of temp, which we would have hoped was just that. Why didn't it get that? Count curly braces start off at 1. If it's a closing curly brace, decrement count curly braces. If count curly braces is 0, we're done. See out temp. Well, this is the guy we're never getting into. Else, if it's an opening square bracket, do this. Regardless, just keep building up. Walk through this. I call process JSON object. I say, is that a square bracket? Yes. I call process array. Process array is going to start collecting. Ah, I think this is what you're saying. Since I call process array immediately, I go from here, I call process array here. I never actually notice that this guy is an object, so I don't call process object. Because we taught process object to see arrays, but we didn't, and we also taught process object to see objects, but we didn't tell process arrays how to see objects. So the logic that we have in here for dealing with opening and closing curly braces, if I see an opening curly brace inside of process array, if it's an opening curly brace, then we call process JSON object to let it go ahead and process that guy. So now we walk through it. You highlight it. If you wanted to indent back, you hit Shift Tab. If you wanted to indent forward, you hit Tab. Okay, so this will call process array. Well, this will call process object, which will then call process array, which will then call process object to capture this guy, which will then call process array, finish that, which will finish up the first call to process object, which will then hit the second call to process object. I think this should do it. getting extras. Val 1, Val 2. So that's the val 3, val 4, which I think is correct. That's getting the second one. So this is the contents of this array, val 3, val 4. First inside, val 3, val 4, val 1, val 2. That's the contents of the first object. Let me just make sure it's didn't do something stupid here. Okay, it is calling it twice. So I must have something recursive in here. Process JSON object. If it's an array, call process JSON array. I'm thinking it's because of this. Well, no, I'm asking if the start of it is an array, go to process JSON array. I think that's okay. Otherwise, if the start is an opening curly brace, start building up temp for this guy. I see another opening curly brace, process JSON object, passing it JSON in the current position where I found that opening curly brace. Increment count curly braces. It's a closing curly brace, decrement if I'm done, output. If it's a square bracket, it's a process JSON, so I'm going to call process JSON, but is that, I have to think that's maybe where we're getting, no, I think that's right. If I run into an opening square bracket, what does that mean I do? It means I call process array. If I run into a closing or an opening curly brace, what does that mean? I call process JSON object. If I run into a closing curly brace, what do? I'm at the end of an object, deal with it. When I call process array, which is the thing we just made a change to. Let's see what we had to have broken something in there. Process JSON array says, okay, you wouldn't be calling me unless the first element is an opening square bracket. So I'll start one element after that and start capturing this stuff. If it's an opening square bracket, if the next thing is an opening square bracket, which it likely wouldn't be the very first time in, but it could be, I'll call process JSON array. If it's a closing square bracket, decrement, deal with process JSON, or deal with this guy if I'm done, if I found the corresponding bracket. Else if I'm looking at an opening curly brace, this is the thing we added. I call process JSON object. Process JSON object, which then calls process JSON array, which then goes in here and calls process JSON object. Process JSON object collects. As soon as he hits this, he's done with process JSON object. That should be the first thing. Right here, he's going to call JSON array here, collect. Notice he's done, and that prints out, and that's doing it. So we're seeing that part right here. Well, I'm thinking we're not dealing with this. I hope not. Let's see. Yeah, outside my for loop here. Outside of my for loop. process JSON arrays, do they do anything when they see a closing curly brace? I think the answer is no. If my whole world is processing this array, I don't care about closing curly braces. I do care about opening curly braces, so I can hand that off to process JSON object, who's in charge of dealing with things that have curly braces. So I'll collect. I pause while this guy goes and does his thing. So that's inside of JSON object. If I see an opening square bracket, this guy right here, I call process JSON array and let him go do his thing. When he's done with that, I'll still come down here and I'll tack on my opening square bracket. I'll tack on the things in the middle. So he's going to still collect. When he gets to the end of this guy right here, his closing curly brace, what does he do? That's closing curly brace there. Count curly braces. Count curly braces is equal to 0. Put out temp. But if I hit a closing curly brace here, I also want this guy to finish. Because he's finished his job of collecting this object, right? That's the job of this guy. So if I'm in this thing with the closing curly brace, I want to go ahead and return, make this method immediately end. I have finished collecting this JSON object, which will then allow the original call to JSON array to keep going. It'll read in the comma. So this guy is now complete. I have finished my original call to, well, my second call to JSON object. So now I'm back to JSON array. I'll read in the comma. I hit another opening. So it keeps reading. It then calls process JSON object. Wait a minute. I have a poorly formatted, right? I think that was it. Well, I do think I was supposed to return, but I also think I have a bug in my JSON. Opening curly brace. Ay. Val 1, val 2, val 3, so that's the contents of the first thing. Here's the contents of the second thing. Here's the contents of that array. But why is it getting to the second thing before it gets to the first thing in terms of outputting? Go ahead.
Just so you are aware, the official time.
Oh, is it? Oh, thank you. It was 5 minutes ago. Yeah. All right. So let me get this fixed up. I won't give you homework yet because I want you to have a working starting point. So I'll get this, whatever the bug is, it's probably something stupid. I'll get it fixed up for Thursday and then give you a starting point for your assignment over the weekend. Questions, comments, concerns, bribes? All right, I'll see everybody on Thursday. Just everybody just gets up. The room just starts emptying.